Morty's transformation into a version of Rick is not sudden, dramatic, or announced. It unfolds quietly, through necessity rather than ambition. At no point does Morty express a desire to become Rick. In fact, much of his early behavior is defined by resistance to Rick's worldview. Yet over time, Morty begins to resemble Rick not in intellect, but in function. The traits that allow Rick to survive the multiverse gradually imprint themselves onto Morty, not because Morty admires them, but because the environment rewards them. In the earliest phase of the series, Morty's defining feature is hesitation. He reacts emotionally to danger, struggles to process violence, and seeks reassurance before acting. His morality is immediate and visceral. He feels fear before understanding risk and guilt, before calculating outcome. Rick, by contrast, operates almost entirely through preemption. He anticipates consequences and acts before emotions can interfere. The gap between them is not just experience, but method. As Morty is repeatedly exposed to Rick's way of life, that gap begins to close, not through instruction, but through pressure. Morty learns quickly that hesitation is punished, indecision increases suffering, emotional delay often leads to worse outcomes. The multiverse. Rick drags Morty through does not reward innocence. It consumes it. Each encounter forces Morty to adapt, and adaptation slowly reshapes his instincts. One of the first noticeable changes is Morty's relationship with violence. Early, Morty treats violence as shocking and unacceptable. Later, Morty treats it as situational. He does not enjoy it, but he no longer freezes in its presence. This mirrors Rick's own posture. Rick does not relish violence as cruelty, but as a tool. Morty begins to internalize this distinction. Action becomes possible even when it is morally uncomfortable. This shift does not eliminate Morty's guilt, but it changes its timing. Guilt follows action rather than preventing it. That sequencing matters. Acting first and processing later is a core Rick trait. It allows survival in high-chaos environments. Morty adopts it reluctantly, but consistently. Once this pattern establishes itself, it does not reverse. Morty becomes capable of making hard decisions under pressure, without collapsing. The difference between him and Rick is no longer the ability to act, but the cost he pays afterward. Morty's growing ability to anticipate outcomes marks another critical step in the transformation. Early Morty is reactive. He responds to threats as they emerge. Later, Morty begins predicting behavior, consequences, and escalation. He starts making choices based on what will happen rather than what is happening. This is one of Rick's defining cognitive habits. Rick lives several steps ahead of the present. Morty begins to do the same, not through genius, but through accumulated experience. This predictive behavior changes Morty's moral framework. Early, Morty judges actions primarily by intent. Later, Morty judges them by outcome. He learns that good intentions do not prevent harm, and that inaction can be as destructive as cruelty. Rick has long operated under this assumption. Morty arrives at it painfully, through repeated exposure to irreversible loss. The result is a more strategic, less idealistic approach to decision-making. Another major shift occurs in Morty's relationship with authority, particularly Rick's. Early, Morty defers automatically. He assumes Rick knows best, even when uncomfortable. Over time, Morty stops treating Rick's intelligence as moral authority. He questions instructions, challenges assumptions, and sometimes ignores Rick entirely. This behavior is deeply Rick-like. Rick does not obey authority. He evaluates it. Morty begins applying that same filter to Rick himself. This change unsettles Rick precisely because he recognizes it. Rick does not punish Morty's growing independence consistently. Instead, he oscillates between irritation and silence. This inconsistency suggests recognition rather than surprise. Rick understands what Morty is becoming because he recognizes the pattern. It is the same pattern that produced him. Morty's emotional regulation also shifts in a distinctly Rick-like direction. Early, Morty externalizes distress. He panics, cries, and seeks comfort. Later, Morty internalizes stress. He becomes quieter under pressure. He compartmentalizes. These are survival mechanisms Rick mastered long ago. Morty does not become emotionally numb, but he learns to delay expression. Feelings are no longer allowed to interfere with immediate survival. This internalization comes at a cost. Morty becomes more isolated. He shares less. He explains himself less. He assumes responsibility without seeking validation. These behaviors mirror Rick's emotional isolation, though Morty experiences them with greater discomfort. Where Rick uses isolation as armor, Morty experiences it as erosion. Still, the behavior persists because it works. Morty's decreasing need for approval is another crucial marker. Early, Morty constantly seeks reassurance, especially from Rick. Later, Morty acts without waiting for acknowledgement. He informs rather than asks. This shift signals a fundamental change in self-concept. Morty no longer defines himself through Rick's perception. Rick has always operated this way. Approval has never been part of his decision-making process. Morty begins to mirror that autonomy. The most unsettling aspect of Morty's transformation is that it happens without any increase in cynicism. Morty does not adopt Rick's nihilism wholesale. Instead, he learns to function within it. He accepts that the universe is hostile, without accepting that nothing matters. This creates a hybrid mindset. Morty becomes capable of Rick-like action, while retaining moral discomfort. This combination is rare and dangerous. Evil, Morty, represents the extreme endpoint of this trajectory, but he is not its origin. He is what happens when Morty's adaptation is allowed to continue without interruption. The existence of evil. Morty confirms that Morty's transformation is not accidental. It is structural. Morty's raised under Rick-like conditions converge toward Rick-like behaviors. The difference lies in whether empathy is suppressed or weaponized. Your Morty sits between these outcomes. He is becoming more capable, more decisive, more strategic. He is not becoming cruel by default, but he is becoming harder. He learns when to detach, when to manipulate, and when to accept loss. These lessons are indistinguishable from Rick's survival playbook. Morty is not copying Rick consciously. He is internalizing the rules Rick already lives by. Rick's response to this transformation is complex. He undermines Morty verbally, yet relies on him more practically. He dismisses Morty's competence, yet allows him greater autonomy. This contradiction reflects fear rather than confidence. Rick recognizes that Morty is becoming someone who no longer needs him in the same way. At the same time, Rick understands that this transformation is the direct result of the environment he created. The tragedy is that Morty's transformation is framed as necessary. The show does not present an alternative path within Rick's world. Softness is punished. Hesitation is fatal, empathy is exploitable. Morty's evolution is a response to sustained exposure to these rules. Becoming more like Rick is not a betrayal of Morty's values. It is a strategy for surviving long enough to keep them. Over time, Morty's behavior begins to resemble Rick's in subtle but unmistakable ways. He lies more easily. He withholds information strategically. He accepts morally compromised solutions when no clean options exist. These are not signs of corruption, but of adaptation. Morty is learning how to function in a system that Rick mastered long ago. The most important distinction is that Morty does not enjoy this transformation. Rick embraces his detachment as superiority. Morty experiences his as loss. That discomfort is the last remaining barrier between Morty and becoming fully Rick-like. Whether that barrier holds is one of the central tensions of the series. Morty's gradual transformation into a mini-Rick is not about intelligence or ambition. It is about exposure. Given enough time in Rick's universe, Rick-like traits become necessary for survival. Morty is not being trained. He is being shaped. Rick sees this happening. He understands it better than anyone else. And that understanding explains his fear. Because once Morty becomes fully capable of acting like Rick, the only thing separating them will be choice. And Rick knows exactly what choice he made when he was forced to become who he is. That choice is what ultimately defines the difference between Rick and Morty, and it is the axis on which Morty's transformation becomes truly unsettling. Morty is not losing himself in the way Rick once did. He is learning Rick's methods without surrendering completely to Rick's conclusions. This creates a version of Morty who can operate with Rick-like efficiency while still feeling the weight of his actions. From Rick's perspective, this is far more dangerous than a Morty who simply breaks. Rick's own transformation occurred in response to loss that convinced him attachment was a liability. Morty's transformation occurs under constant pressure rather than singular trauma. This difference matters. Rick's detachment was a defense built after the fact. Morty's detachment is preventative. He learns to armor himself before damage can fully land. This makes his evolution quieter, less dramatic, and harder to detect, even for Rick. As Morty adopts Rick-like strategies, his emotional responses become more delayed and more controlled. He still reacts internally, but he does not allow those reactions to dictate immediate behavior. This mirrors Rick's compartmentalization almost perfectly. The difference is that Rick no longer feels conflict about using this mechanism, while Morty still does. That internal conflict is what keeps Morty from becoming a full replica, but it does not stop the behavioral convergence. Morty's increasing comfort with manipulation further illustrates this shift. Early Morty is transparent to a fault. He explains himself, confesses, and overshares. Later, Morty withholds information when it serves a purpose. He learns that honesty is not always safe, and that strategic silence can prevent greater harm. Rick has always operated under this assumption. Morty arrives there reluctantly, guided by repeated proof rather than ideology. This change also affects how Morty views truth. Early Morty treats truth as inherently good and deception as inherently wrong. Later, Morty understands that truth can be destructive in unstable systems. He begins weighing disclosure against outcome. This ethical calculation is central to Rick's worldview. Morty adopts it not because he believes in it philosophically, but because experience demonstrates its necessity. Morty's posture toward risk also shifts in a Rick-like direction. Early, Morty avoids risk instinctively. Later, Morty evaluates it. He distinguishes between survivable danger and catastrophic exposure. He no longer reacts to fear alone. He calculates tolerance. Rick's entire existence is built on this skill. Morty, learning it, marks a decisive step away from innocence. Rick notices these changes even when he refuses to acknowledge them directly. His tone toward Morty becomes sharper but less controlling. He intervenes less often, not because he trusts Morty fully, but because he recognizes competence. Rick has always respected capability, even when he resents it. Morty's growing effectiveness forces Rick into an uncomfortable position where dismissal no longer aligns with reality. This is why Rick's insults toward Morty often intensify as Morty becomes more capable. The insults are no longer corrective. They are defensive. Rick attempts to reassert a hierarchy that behavior no longer supports. Morty's actions increasingly speak louder than Rick's framing, and Rick senses the imbalance. Morty's adaptation also reshapes his relationship with consequence. Early Morty is overwhelmed by consequence. Later, Morty anticipates it and absorbs it. He accepts that some outcomes will hurt and proceeds anyway. Rick has lived in this space for decades. Morty stepping into it marks a loss of innocence that cannot be recovered. Yet Morty's empathy does not disappear. It becomes selective. He learns when empathy will save lives and when it will paralyze him. This selectivity mirrors Rick's own prioritization, but Morty experiences it with more friction. Rick's empathy is suppressed. Morty's is managed. That distinction is subtle, but crucial. Evil Morty represents the point where that friction disappears entirely. He is not smarter because he is evil. He is more efficient because he has removed emotional resistance. Your Morty has not crossed that line, but the path is visible. The show deliberately places evil Morty in the background to remind the audience where unchecked adaptation leads. Rick understands this trajectory better than Morty does. He has seen versions of it across realities. He knows that mortals who survive long enough inevitably harden. The difference is that this Morty is doing so while retaining moral awareness. That combination threatens Rick's worldview more than pure ruthlessness ever could. Morty becoming a mini-Rick is not a victory for Rick. It is an indictment. It suggests that Rick's way of surviving is contagious, not inevitable. It spreads through exposure, not destiny. Morty did not need Rick's intelligence to become like him. He only needed Rick's environment. That realization explains Rick's increasing instability. He cannot claim that his detachment was the only option if Morty can operate effectively while still caring. Morty's hybrid evolution undermines Rick's self-justification. It suggests that Rick abandoned parts of himself that may not have needed to be abandoned. This is why Rick both fears and depends on Morty's transformation. He needs Morty to survive alongside him. He fears what Morty's survival implies. Morty is becoming capable of standing next to Rick rather than behind him, and that proximity forces comparison. Morty's gradual transformation is therefore not about replacing Rick. It is about reflecting him. Morty holds up a version of Rick that still feels, still hesitates, and still chooses meaning despite chaos. That reflection is unbearable for someone who built an identity around denying those possibilities. In the end, Morty does not become Rick because he wants power, control, or dominance. He becomes Rick because the universe Rick inhabits demands those traits for survival. The difference is that Morty experiences that demand as tragedy rather than triumph. Rick sees this. He understands it. And that understanding explains why he tries so hard to suppress Morty's growth while simultaneously relying on it. Because once Morty fully understands how to survive like Rick, he will also understand that Rick's version of survival was not the only one available. And that knowledge is something Rick has spent his entire life trying to outrun. That knowledge lingers beneath every interaction between them, shaping the final stage of Morty's transformation. By this point, Morty no longer needs to consciously imitate Rick's behavior. The traits have become instinctive. He assesses situations quickly, prioritizes survival, and accepts compromise as unavoidable. These responses emerge automatically, without the hesitation that once defined him. This automaticity is what marks the deepest convergence. When behavior becomes reflex, transformation is complete. Yet Morty's reflexes remain morally charged in a way Rick's are not. Morty still feels the weight of what he does, even when he acts decisively. He carries responsibility forward instead of discarding it. This distinction prevents Morty from becoming an exact replica, but it does not undo the resemblance. In practice, Morty now operates using the same toolkit Rick relies on: calculation, detachment, and strategic sacrifice. The difference lies only in how each processes the aftermath. Rick's awareness of this convergence sharpens his internal conflict. On one hand, Morty's competence validates Rick's worldview. It proves that survival requires hardness. On the other hand, Morty's continued empathy exposes a flaw in Rick's conclusions. If Morty can endure the same chaos without fully abandoning himself, then Rick's total detachment appears excessive, rather than necessary. Morty becomes living evidence that Rick may have overcorrected. This realization destabilizes Rick more than any external threat. Rick can destroy enemies, escape systems, and outthink institutions. He cannot easily dismiss proof that contradicts his core justification for who he became. Morty's transformation is therefore both confirmation and accusation. It confirms the brutality of the universe while accusing Rick of surrendering too much of himself to survive it. Morty's growing independence intensifies this tension. He no longer relies on Rick to interpret reality for him. He draws conclusions independently and acts on them. Rick loses his role as sole navigator. Instead of leading Morty through chaos, Rick finds himself moving alongside someone who understands the terrain. This shift alters their dynamic fundamentally. Morty is no longer cargo. He is a co-survivor. Rick reacts to this shift with ambiguity rather than outright resistance. He allows Morty more freedom, but he also distances himself emotionally. This distancing serves two purposes. It protects Rick from attachment to someone who no longer needs him, and it shields him from confronting what Morty represents. Emotional withdrawal becomes a way to avoid reckoning. Morty, meanwhile, grows quieter. He explains less and assumes more. He accepts that Rick will not validate his growth. This acceptance marks a final loss of innocence. Morty no longer expects fairness from Rick or the universe. He simply acts. This stoicism is unmistakably Rick-like. The difference is that Morty does not celebrate it. He endures it. The show reinforces this transformation by altering how Morty is framed visually and narratively. He is placed in positions of responsibility more frequently. He makes calls that affect others. He absorbs consequences without collapse. These moments are not highlighted as turning points. They are treated as normal. Normalization signals completion. What was once extraordinary has become routine. Evil Morty's existence continues to hover over this arc as a warning rather than a destination. He represents the point where emotional friction is eliminated entirely. Your Morty has not crossed that threshold, but the similarities are no longer deniable. The divergence between them lies not in capability, but in choice. Whether Morty continues to feel the cost of his actions will determine whether the transformation ends as adaptation or becomes something colder. Rick understands this fork in the road. His fear is not that Morty will become exactly like him, but that Morty will become like him without losing his conscience. That outcome would render Rick's sacrifices unnecessary. It would prove that Rick did not need to abandon empathy to survive. That possibility undermines the narrative Rick has lived by for decades. Morty's transformation into a mini-Rick is therefore not a simple inheritance. It is a tension between necessity and refusal. Morty adopts the tools Rick uses while resisting the worldview that shaped them. He learns how to survive without fully accepting that survival requires emotional annihilation. This hybrid state is unstable, but powerful. The tragedy is that Rick cannot help Morty navigate this state without confronting his own regrets. Guidance would require honesty. Honesty would require acknowledging that Rick's path was not the only one. Rick avoids this confrontation by remaining distant, critical, and dismissive. Morty is left to navigate the final stages of transformation alone. In doing so, Morty becomes something Rick never planned for. Not a successor, not a rival, but a mirror that reflects an alternative outcome. Morty demonstrates that adaptation does not have to end in nihilism. It can end in resilience paired with care. That outcome terrifies Rick because it reframes his entire existence. Morty's gradual transformation is complete, not when he becomes cruel, but when he becomes capable of cruelty and chooses restraint. That choice is the final divergence between them. Rick learned how to survive by abandoning parts of himself. Morty is learning how to survive while carrying those parts forward, even when it hurts. Rick sees this future forming. He understands it intuitively. And that understanding explains his unease, his volatility, and his contradictory behavior toward Morty. Because once Morty becomes fully Rick-like in ability without becoming Rick-like in belief, the hierarchy between them collapses completely. At that point, Morty will no longer need Rick as a guide, a shield, or an authority. He will only need him as proof of a path not taken. And that is the one role Rick has never been able to tolerate. That intolerance defines the final tension of Morty's transformation. Rick cannot stop Morty from changing, but he can refuse to acknowledge what that change means. Denial becomes Rick's last defense. He continues to frame Morty as unreliable, emotional, and replaceable, even as Morty repeatedly demonstrates competence under pressure. This dissonance is not accidental. It is a refusal to accept the implications of Morty's growth. Morty, by contrast, no longer needs Rick's recognition for his evolution to continue. Earlier versions of Morty would have stalled without approval or guidance. This version does not. He proceeds based on internal assessment, rather than external validation. That independence marks the point where transformation becomes irreversible. Morty has internalized Rick's survival logic without internalizing Rick's despair. The most striking evidence of this lies in Morty's restraint. Where Rick often escalates situations reflexively, Morty increasingly chooses when not to act. He recognizes that not every problem requires domination, destruction, or escape. This selective engagement is something Rick struggles with. Rick reacts because he can. Morty pauses because he understands cost. This difference highlights how Morty's transformation diverges even as it converges. Morty's silence becomes one of his most Rick-like traits. Early, Morty fills space with fear, explanation, and pleading. Later, Morty allows silence to exist. He does not narrate his thoughts. He does not justify every decision. Silence, in this context, is control. Rick has always wielded silence as power. Morty adopts it as stability. The similarity is unmistakable. Rick's awareness of Morty's restraint deepens his unease. Power paired with restraint is something Rick respects and fears in equal measure. It signals maturity without arrogance. Rick has rarely encountered it because most beings either lack power or abuse it. Morty's balance unsettles Rick precisely because it is sustainable. The series reinforces this by placing Morty in situations where Rick would typically intervene, only for Morty to handle the outcome himself. Rick's absence in these moments is telling. He does not step in because he cannot justify doing so. Morty's competence leaves no opening. Rick is forced into the unfamiliar role of observer. This reversal is subtle but profound. Rick built his identity around being indispensable. Morty's transformation threatens that identity without confrontation. Rick is not challenged directly. He is simply no longer required in the same way. That loss of necessity is more destabilizing than any defeat. Morty's continued moral awareness prevents the transformation from becoming a descent. He still recognizes harm as harm. He still feels responsible for outcomes. What changes is his tolerance for acting in spite of that awareness. This capacity allows Morty to function where earlier versions would have broken. It also allows him to avoid the nihilistic collapse Rick experienced. Morty does not need to believe nothing matters in order to endure. Rick understands the significance of this difference intuitively. He sees in Morty the possibility of a self he never allowed himself to be. That recognition fuels resentment as much as fear. Morty is not just becoming like Rick, he is becoming what Rick might have been if he had made different choices. The show never frames this transformation as triumphant. Morty's growth is accompanied by exhaustion, quiet sadness, and emotional distance. He loses simplicity, not just fear. The cost of becoming Rick-like is real, and Morty pays it consciously. That awareness is the final divergence. Rick buried his awareness to survive. Morty carries his forward. By the end of this arc, Morty occupies a liminal space. He is no longer the child Rick can drag through chaos unquestioningly. He is not yet a figure who has surrendered to nihilism. He exists between survival and meaning, capable of navigating both. This position is unstable, but it is powerful. Rick cannot exist comfortably around someone in this space. It challenges his assumptions at every level. Intelligence is no longer the sole metric of capability. Detachment is no longer the only viable defense. Control is no longer guaranteed by superiority. Morty's presence erodes these certainties simply by continuing to function. Morty's gradual transformation into a mini-Rick is therefore not a replication, but an evolution. He inherits the tools without inheriting the surrender. He learns the rules without accepting them as absolute. This distinction is what terrifies Rick most, because it suggests that Rick's transformation was not the only path through chaos. In the end, Morty does not replace Rick. He outgrows the need to become him fully. The transformation stops short, not because Morty lacks capacity, but because he makes a different choice. That choice preserves something Rick lost long ago. Rick sees this future forming, and he recoils from it, not because it threatens his power, but because it threatens his narrative. Morty's existence as a capable, caring survivor undermines the story Rick tells himself about why he became who he is. And that is the final irony of Morty's transformation. Becoming more like Rick does not bring Morty closer to Rick. It creates distance built not from rebellion, but from understanding. Morty learns how to survive the universe Rick mastered. He just refuses to survive it the same way. That refusal is what ultimately defines the arc. Morty's transformation does not conclude with him standing opposite Rick as an adversary, nor beside him as an equal in domination. It concludes with Morty standing apart, capable of operating within Rick's world without surrendering entirely to its logic. This separation is subtle, but it is permanent. Once Morty understands the rules well enough to choose how to engage with them, the transformation reaches its end. Rick's discomfort intensifies precisely because he cannot frame this outcome as failure. Morty survives. Morty adapts. Morty makes decisions Rick would make, often faster and with fewer theatrics, yet Morty does not collapse into the same emotional void. From Rick's perspective, this creates an impossible contradiction. If Morty can endure the same conditions without becoming hollow, then Rick's own collapse into nihilism appears less like wisdom and more like surrender. This realization does not arrive as a single revelation. It accumulates slowly, in moments where Rick expects Morty to hesitate and he does not, expects Morty to break and he holds, expects Morty to seek guidance and he proceeds independently. Each of these moments chips away at Rick's authority, not as power, but as inevitability. Rick's way of being is no longer presented as the only viable response to chaos. Morty's transformation is therefore complete not when he mirrors Rick's actions, but when Rick's reactions begin to mirror Morty's presence. Rick becomes more cautious around him, more restrained, less dismissive in situations where Morty's judgment has already proven reliable. Rick does not admit this shift openly. He resists it. But his behavior adapts. Respect emerges not through acknowledgement, but through adjustment. The distance between them grows quieter rather than louder. There is no rupture, no dramatic separation. Instead, there is a growing asymmetry in need. Rick still benefits from Morty's presence, but Morty no longer depends on Rick's worldview to function. This imbalance reverses the original dynamic. Rick keeps Morty close out of necessity. Morty stays close out of choice. That choice is the final divergence. Rick never chose his detachment. He retreated into it. Morty chooses restraint repeatedly, knowing the cost and accepting it anyway. This conscious engagement with consequence is what prevents Morty from becoming fully Rick-like. He does not deny meaning to escape pain. He accepts pain as part of meaning. The show leaves this transformation deliberately unresolved in a traditional sense. Morty is still young. He is still shaped by exposure. The potential to become colder remains. But the trajectory has shifted. Morty now possesses the awareness required to stop himself from crossing certain lines. That awareness did not come from instruction. It came from survival. Rick's fear, resentment, and volatility toward Morty make sense in this context. Morty is no longer proof that Rick was right about the universe. He is proof that Rick may have been incomplete. That proof cannot be destroyed without destroying the last genuine connection Rick maintains. Rick is trapped between denial and acknowledgement, and Morty exists in the space that trap creates. Morty's gradual transformation into a mini-Rick was never about becoming smarter, stronger, or more dominant. It was about becoming capable of acting without guidance, capable of enduring without collapse, capable of choosing restraint where destruction would be easier. These are Rick's skills, refined and redirected. The tragedy is that Rick recognizes the beauty of this outcome, even as it invalidates him. He sees Morty surviving in a way that does not require total abandonment of self. That vision is unbearable to someone who built his identity on the belief that abandonment was necessary. Morty becomes living evidence that Rick paid a price he may not have had to pay. In the end, Morty does not escape Rick's shadow by opposing him. He escapes it by learning everything Rick knows and then choosing what to keep. That selective inheritance is what makes Morty dangerous, not as a threat, but as a contradiction. Rick can destroy universes. Morty can live in one without surrendering entirely to it. That difference is small, quiet, and irreversible, and it is the true endpoint of Morty's transformation. That irreversibility is what gives the transformation its weight. Morty cannot return to the person he was before Rick's world reshaped him, just as Rick cannot return to the person he might have been before his own losses hardened him. The difference is that Morty reaches this point with awareness rather than denial. He knows what he is becoming, and that knowledge gives him agency over the final shape of it. Rick never had that luxury. His transformation was reactive, driven by grief and survival. Morty's is adaptive, driven by understanding. This distinction matters because it changes what comes next. Rick's path closed inward, collapsing toward isolation and control. Morty's path remains open, even as it narrows. He learns when to harden and when to soften. He does not confuse endurance with emptiness. By the end of this arc, Morty no longer needs to prove anything to Rick. He no longer needs to resist openly or comply quietly. He operates from a place of internal calibration. This is the most Rick-like trait he acquires, and also the one Rick least wants to see reflected back at him. Self-direction, without contempt, undermines Rick's claim that detachment is the price of clarity. The show reinforces this by allowing Morty moments of quiet competence without spectacle. There is no announcement of growth, no triumphant framing. Morty simply handles situations that once overwhelmed him. The absence of emphasis is the emphasis. Growth has become normal. Normality is the final stage of transformation. Rick's reaction to this normality is telling. He does not celebrate it. He does not openly sabotage it either. He exists in a state of tense coexistence, alternating between reliance and dismissal. This instability reflects a man confronted with evidence that contradicts his deepest belief about himself. Rick has always claimed that survival requires emotional sacrifice. Morty survives while keeping parts of himself intact. That contradiction cannot be resolved through intellect alone. Morty's transformation also reframes the role of evil Morty within the narrative. Evil Morty is no longer simply a warning about ambition or resentment. He becomes a boundary marker. He shows what Morty could become if adaptation continues without restraint. The fact that your Morty does not cross that boundary is not accidental. It is the result of choice, layered on top of experience. Choice is what ultimately separates Morty from Rick. Rick reacts to pain by closing off. Morty reacts to pain by recalibrating. He does not deny suffering, but he does not let it dictate every future decision. This balance is fragile, but it is real. It represents a form of survival Rick never learned. The irony is that Rick taught Morty everything he needed to outgrow him, not through lessons, but through exposure. Rick believed that showing Morty the worst of existence would either break him or numb him. Instead, it trained him. Morty learned how to function under pressure, how to read people, how to anticipate outcomes, and how to act decisively. What Rick did not account for was Morty's refusal to abandon care entirely. That refusal is the final break in the pattern. Morty becomes capable of Rick-like action without embracing Rick-like despair. He inherits the tools, not the surrender. This makes him something Rick cannot categorize. Not a sidekick, not a threat, not a successor. Something quieter and more unsettling. Morty's gradual transformation into a mini-Rick is therefore a misnomer in its final form. Morty does not become a smaller version of Rick. He becomes a divergence, a proof that the same environment can produce a different outcome if someone is willing to endure discomfort without erasing themselves. Rick senses this truth even if he never articulates it. It explains his fear, his defensiveness, and his volatility. Morty represents the possibility that Rick's story about himself was incomplete. That possibility threatens Rick more than any enemy ever could. In the end, Morty stands as the result of Rick's world filtered through choice. Hardened, capable, restrained, and still human. Rick stands as the result of the same world filtered through loss and denial. Brilliant, powerful, and isolated. They are no longer moving toward the same destination. And that is the quiet conclusion of Morty's transformation. Not a takeover, not a rebellion, not a descent, but a separation forged by understanding. One that Rick can see coming, and one he has never known how to stop. That separation does not resolve cleanly, and the show never pretends that it does. Morty's transformation leaves behind an uncomfortable equilibrium rather than a new hierarchy. Rick is still more intelligent, more experienced, and more dangerous in raw terms. Morty is still younger, less knowledgeable, and more vulnerable. Yet, the axis of power has shifted. Rick can no longer assume psychological dominance, and Morty no longer assumes inferiority. This mutual recognition, however unspoken, marks the true end of the transformation. What follows is not peace, but recalibration. Rick adjusts his behavior around Morty in subtle ways. He explains less, but also interferes less. He mocks more sharply, but relies more heavily. These contradictions reveal a man attempting to preserve superiority while adapting to its erosion. Rick is not afraid of Morty's strength. He is unsettled by Morty's steadiness. Strength can be countered. Steadiness cannot. Morty's steadiness is what ultimately distinguishes him from Rick. Rick's confidence fluctuates with control. When control slips, volatility emerges. Morty's confidence, once formed, does not rely on domination. It rests on self-knowledge. Morty knows what he can tolerate, what he will compromise, and what he will not surrender. This clarity reduces fear without erasing care. It allows Morty to act without needing to win. Rick has never learned how to exist without needing to win. His identity is bound to outmaneuvering, outthinking, and outlasting. Morty's evolution introduces a different mode of survival, one that accepts loss without collapsing, accepts limitation without resentment, and accepts pain without converting it into contempt. This mode does not threaten Rick physically, but it undermines him existentially. The show makes no promise about where Morty's path ultimately leads. The risk of further hardening remains. Exposure continues. Pressure does not disappear. Morty could still lose pieces of himself. The difference is that now he would recognize what he is losing. Awareness does not guarantee preservation, but it makes loss a choice rather than an accident. Rick sees this awareness and recoils from it. He cannot guide Morty through it without confronting the parts of himself he abandoned. He cannot suppress it without acknowledging its legitimacy. He is left only with distance, irony, and deflection. These tools once kept him untouchable. Now they only delay confrontation. Morty's gradual transformation into a mini Rick was never about becoming colder, smarter, or more powerful. It was about learning how to survive long, enough to choose differently. That lesson is complete. What Morty does with it remains open. Rick's tragedy is that he understands this better than anyone else. He knows that Morty is no longer becoming him. Morty is becoming what Rick might have been if he had learned to endure pain without turning it into a philosophy. That knowledge lingers between them, unspoken and unresolved. It reshapes every interaction without announcing itself. It is the reason Rick watches Morty more closely. It is the reason Morty no longer looks back as often. In the end, Morty does not escape Rick's influence by rejecting it. He escapes it by understanding it completely and refusing to let it define him. That is the final, quiet truth of Morty's transformation. Not that he became Rick, but that he learned how not to. That quiet truth is what gives the arc its lasting unease. Morty's transformation does not culminate in a decisive moment, a declaration, or a visible break. It culminates in absence. The absence of panic where it once lived. The absence of dependence where it once defined him. The absence of illusion where Rick's authority once stood unquestioned. These absences are subtle, but they are permanent. Rick continues to operate as though he is unchanged, but his behavior betrays adaptation. He no longer assumes Morty will fail. He no longer treats Morty's survival as incidental. He anticipates Morty's competence even when he refuses to acknowledge it aloud. This anticipation alters Rick's planning, his risk tolerance, and his willingness to leave Morty unsupervised. Rick does not do this out of trust. He does it out of recognition. Morty has crossed a threshold. Morty, for his part, no longer needs to prove that threshold exists. He does not announce growth. He does not argue for autonomy. He simply behaves as someone who understands the terrain. He navigates danger with calm rather than bravado. He accepts compromise without self-betrayal. He absorbs loss without collapsing into nihilism. These behaviors signal a maturity that cannot be undone by reset, insult, or dismissal. What makes this transformation unsettling is that it offers no catharsis. There is no moment where Morty triumphs over Rick, and no moment where Rick concedes ground. The shift exists entirely in subtext and behavior. This is consistent with the show's broader treatment of growth. Change happens whether or not it is acknowledged. Time passes whether or not it is honored. Morty's transformation also reframes earlier seasons retroactively. What once appeared as naivete becomes groundwork. What once appeared as weakness becomes sensitivity that later informs judgment. Morty's empathy, once framed as liability, becomes the stabilizing force that prevents full collapse. Rick's dismissal of that empathy is revealed as short-sighted rather than correct. Rick senses this reframing, and it unsettles him. His intelligence allows him to see patterns across time, including his own. Morty's evolution exposes a version of Rick's past where different choices might have led to a different outcome. That counterfactual is intolerable. It suggests that Rick's isolation was not destiny, but decision. The show never forces Rick to confront this directly. Instead, it allows the tension to persist. Rick and Morty continue traveling together, but the terms have changed. Rick no longer defines the rules alone. Morty understands them too well. Authority becomes negotiation. Guidance becomes optional. Control becomes fragile. This fragility is the final marker of Morty's transformation. Rick's dominance relied on asymmetry of understanding. Once that asymmetry disappears, dominance must be maintained artificially or abandoned. Rick attempts the former through sarcasm, distance, and dismissal. Morty responds with calm, silence, and action. The imbalance resolves itself quietly. Morty does not become fearless. He becomes measured. He does not become detached. He becomes selective. He does not become superior. He becomes sufficient. These qualities allow him to exist in Rick's universe without being consumed by it. That is the transformation's true end. Rick remains the most intelligent person in the room, but intelligence alone no longer grants authority over Morty. Experience has equalized something Rick once monopolized. Understanding. Morty understands the cost of survival now. He understands what Rick gave up, and he understands what he is unwilling to surrender. That understanding creates distance, not hostility. Distance born of clarity. Morty no longer needs to fight Rick to escape his shadow. He simply steps out of it. Rick sees this happening and cannot stop it without destroying the last proof that his suffering was not meaningless. Morty represents both indictment and redemption. Rick cannot embrace either without unraveling himself. So they continue forward together, bound by habit, history, and unresolved tension. Rick remains brilliant, volatile, and defensive. Morty remains capable, restrained, and quietly autonomous. Their paths run parallel rather than convergent. Morty's gradual transformation into a mini-Rick was never the story's destination. It was the road that revealed a different destination was possible, and that possibility is what lingers. Not as hope, not as resolution, but as a quiet, irreversible change in who Morty is. A change Rick understands, and one he has never truly known how to face. That inability to face it is where the arc finally settles. Rick does not lose control in a dramatic collapse, nor does Morty seize it in a defining victory. Control simply becomes irrelevant. Morty's transformation renders domination unnecessary. He no longer needs to overpower Rick's worldview because he understands it completely. Understanding drains it of its authority. Rick's greatest strength has always been foresight. He sees outcomes before others do. In Morty's case, that foresight becomes a curse. Rick sees exactly what Morty is becoming and understands the implications long before Morty does. He knows this version of Morty cannot be fully controlled, cannot be fully discarded, and cannot be easily replaced. Morty has accumulated too much experience, too much internal structure. He is no longer interchangeable. This realization reshapes Rick's behavior in ways that are easy to miss. He tests Morty less. He explains less. He intervenes later. These are not signs of trust. They are signs of resignation. Rick recognizes that Morty no longer requires constant correction to survive. The role Rick built for himself is shrinking, and no amount of genius can reverse that. Morty, meanwhile, does not experience this shift as liberation. He experiences it as responsibility. Being able to act like Rick without becoming Rick means carrying weight Rick long ago set down. Morty carries guilt, memory, and care alongside competence. This makes him slower in some ways, heavier in others. It also makes him stable in a way Rick never was. Stability is the final divergence. Rick survives through motion. Morty survives through balance. Rick escalates to escape. Morty endures to continue. These approaches can coexist for a time, but they are not the same path. Morty's transformation reveals that Rick's way of surviving is not universal, only one option among others. That revelation does not destroy Rick. It unsettles him. It forces him into proximity with a truth he has avoided for decades. That intelligence alone does not determine how one responds to suffering. Choice does. Morty's choices expose the contingency of Rick's own. The show leaves this tension unresolved because resolution would cheapen it. Morty's transformation is not meant to conclude with clarity or comfort. It is meant to linger as a quiet redefinition of the relationship. Rick and Morty continue traveling together, but the dynamic that once defined them no longer applies. The imbalance that fueled Rick's authority has dissolved. Morty is not stronger than Rick. He is not smarter. He is not more dangerous. He is simply no longer lost. That alone is enough to change everything. Rick understands this and continues forward anyway, armed with irony, intellect, and avoidance. Morty continues forward with restraint, awareness, and unresolved feeling. Neither wins. Neither fully loses. The story moves on, altered by the accumulation of that difference. Morty's gradual transformation into a mini Rick was never about inheritance. It was about exposure revealing alternatives. Morty learned how Rick survives and chose not to survive in exactly the same way. That choice does not free him from cost, but it gives that cost meaning. Rick sees the meaning forming and turns away, not because he cannot understand it, but because he understands it too well. And that is where the transformation truly ends. Not in power, not in rebellion, not in imitation, but in a quiet, irreversible shift where Morty becomes capable of surviving Rick's universe without surrendering himself to it. A shift Rick recognizes, a shift he cannot undo, and a shift that will continue to haunt him long after the chaos fades into routine. That haunting quality reshapes their dynamic without bringing it to a close. Instead of resolution, the series settles into a sustained imbalance where neither character fully reclaims their original role. Rick remains dominant in intellect and resources, but Morty's internal calibration prevents Rick from dictating meaning. Morty no longer needs to be convinced that Rick is right, only that Rick is effective in certain situations. This distinction changes how Morty listens, responds, and decides. Rick adapts to this shift by narrowing the space in which Morty can operate independently. He does not forbid autonomy outright. He contextualizes it. He reframes situations so that Morty's choices appear constrained even when they are not. This is a familiar tactic. Rick has always controlled environments rather than people. What changes is that Morty begins to recognize the architecture of those constraints. Recognition does not eliminate them, but it weakens their influence. Morty's growing awareness allows him to separate Rick's competence from Rick's conclusions. He can accept Rick's technical guidance without absorbing Rick's philosophy. This separation is critical. It allows Morty to survive in Rick's world without inheriting Rick's despair. Morty uses the tools without accepting the narrative that justifies them. That ability did not exist earlier in the series. It emerges only after sustained exposure and accumulated loss. Rick senses this decoupling and responds with inconsistency. At times he over-explains, attempting to reassert narrative dominance. At other times he withdraws entirely, allowing Morty to act without interference. These fluctuations reveal uncertainty rather than strategy. Rick is no longer sure which approach maintains control. The system he relied on has become unstable. Morty's behavior during these moments is telling. He does not exploit Rick's uncertainty aggressively. He does not seek confrontation or leverage. He simply proceeds. He acts as though Rick's approval is no longer a prerequisite for action. This calm persistence erodes hierarchy more effectively than rebellion ever could. Rick is forced to react to outcomes rather than intentions. As Morty continues to operate this way, the environment itself begins to respond differently to him. Other characters treat him with less dismissal. Situations escalate less around him. He becomes a stabilizing presence rather than a catalyst. This is a subtle but important shift. Rick's presence often destabilizes systems. Morty's presence increasingly moderates them. The contrast highlights the divergence in their survival strategies. Rick notices this moderation and struggles to interpret it. He is accustomed to equating effectiveness with disruption. Morty demonstrates effectiveness through restraint. This challenges Rick's assumptions about power. Power, in Morty's hands, becomes quieter and less performative. It does not demand recognition. It simply functions. The longer this pattern persists, the less useful Rick's traditional methods of control become. Insults lose precision. Dismissal loses force. Replacement loses plausibility. Morty's value is no longer derived from proximity to Rick, but from his ability to navigate complexity without collapsing. That capability is portable. It does not depend on Rick's presence. Rick attempts to reassert relevance by escalating complexity. He introduces more variables, more danger, more chaos. This tactic once overwhelmed Morty. Now it serves as a test Morty increasingly passes. Each successful navigation reinforces Morty's independence. Rick's escalation backfires by accelerating the very transformation he resists. Morty's continued emotional awareness prevents this acceleration from becoming destructive. He notices when escalation is unnecessary. He chooses containment over domination when possible. These decisions reduce collateral damage and limit spiral. Rick, accustomed to solving problems through excess, finds this approach alien. He understands it intellectually, but resists it emotionally. This tension produces a new equilibrium rather than a conclusion. Rick and Morty continue interacting, but the terms are altered. Rick is no longer the sole interpreter of reality. Morty contributes meaningfully to judgment calls. Authority becomes situational rather than absolute. This situational authority reflects Morty's maturation more clearly than any dramatic gesture. The series allows this state to persist because it aligns with its broader themes. Growth does not resolve conflict. It redistributes it. Morty's transformation does not eliminate tension with Rick. It changes where that tension resides. It moves from overt domination to subtle negotiation, from fear to friction. Rick's discomfort with this friction manifests as avoidance rather than aggression. He deflects conversations that would force acknowledgement. He changes subjects, escalates scenarios, or reframes stakes. These behaviors delay reckoning, but do not reverse progress. Morty continues to accumulate experience regardless. Morty's restraint remains the defining feature of this phase. He knows he can act decisively, but he also knows when not to. This discretion distinguishes him from Rick more than any shared trait. Rick's default response to uncertainty is action. Morty's is evaluation. That difference shapes outcomes in ways Rick cannot easily dismiss. As this pattern continues, Morty becomes less predictable in a way Rick cannot model. Rick predicts behavior through self-similarity. He assumes others will choose the same shortcuts he would. Morty's refusal to default to those shortcuts disrupts prediction. Rick cannot always anticipate Morty's choices, not because Morty is irrational, but because he operates under a different priority system. That unpredictability does not come from chaos. It comes from values. Morty's values, refined through exposure, guide his decisions more reliably than impulse ever did. Rick understands systems. Morty understands trade-offs. The overlap between those skill sets creates competence without surrender. This state does not collapse into an ending. It persists as a new baseline. Morty is no longer becoming Rick. He has already absorbed what he needed. What remains is refinement rather than transformation. Rick, meanwhile, continues adapting around a reality he did not plan for. The arc does not close because it does not need to. It has already altered the terrain on which future stories unfold. Morty's gradual transformation reshapes his series by changing who he is allowed to be within it. Rick remains central, but no longer singular. From this point forward, their interactions are defined less by instruction and more by coexistence. That coexistence carries tension, but it also carries stability. Morty can survive without surrender. Rick can continue without total control. Neither outcome resolves the conflict, but both acknowledge change. And that change continues to operate quietly, episode after episode, shaping decisions long after the initial transformation has ceased to be visible.